to speak to you Emily Wilson, who is the International Policy Manager at Australian Red Cross, a position she recently moved into after working as the Program Coordinator for Cambodia and Laos for 4 years. Prior to joining Australian Red Cross, Emily worked in Cambodia, one of the most challenging environments, in the Humanitarian Mine Action Centre. She also worked for the Australian Government, both in Canberra and in Geneva, on humanitarian settlement and forced migration issues. This evening, she will provide some examples of accountability and transparency within one of the most talked about aid campaigns, and that is the Australian Red Cross's Syria Bill. Ladies and gentlemen, please a big warm welcome for Emily Wilson.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation. It's great that I can be here and be part of this discussion. I just wanted to start with a question. So sorry for everyone who counts for food, but what do people know about Australian Red Cross? What's the first thing that pops into mind? Just some shout-outs.
Blood donation.
Blood donation? Disaster. Yep, so exactly. Australian Red Cross scope, the work that we do is incredibly diverse and what we're involved in. So we're involved in blood donation, and that's generally the most popular and most well-known area of our work, as well as disasters and throughout communities as well in Australia, working on or supporting community resilience. And I wanted to, start with that because I wanted to highlight that Australian Red Cross as well is part of a global Red Cross Red Crescent movement. We're guided by 7 fundamental principles. So I just want to repeat: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity, and universality. And they're crucial to the way that Australian Red Cross works.
That's better.
And I wanted to touch on there, when I'm talking about Australian Red Cross being part of a movement, there's 3 pillars to that movement. So we have national societies, and national societies is what Australian Red Cross is, and there's 190 national societies throughout the world. Another area, or another component of the movement is the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent. And the Federation sort of acts like a secretariat for the national societies. And it's also has a coordination role during disasters and non-conflict situations. So they're based in Geneva and have offices all over the world. And then I think probably the most well-known component from the international perspective is the International Committee of the Red Cross Red Crescent. So the International Committee has an exclusively humanitarian mission, just to protect the lives and dignity of victims of war and others in situations of violence and to provide them with assistance. So the ICRC will, as they're called in terms of acronyms, there's a lot of acronyms, they are really the custodians and the guardians of international humanitarian law, which are essentially the laws of war. So Red Cross and the movement, we're not government and we're not an NGO. So these 3 areas of the movement, we're independent bodies, and we each have our own individual status, and we don't exercise, we exercise no authority over each other, although we do have agreed mechanisms to ensure coordination of actions, as well as common policy frameworks. So I had trouble thinking about what to focus on for tonight's topic, because accountability and transparency, it touches on so many different areas, and it goes hand in hand with quality programming, which just makes it an even bigger topic. So my first instinct was to have a PowerPoint presentation, because a big way that organisations demonstrate public accountability in particular is through images. And as they say, images speak 1,000 words, and they provide a really great insight into the work of humanitarian agencies, which is often happening really far away and in remote communities. But it's all words tonight, so I'm going to take the opportunity to provide some examples of the work that we do in transparency and accountability that goes on in the background of all the images that we're seeing. So when we think about accountability, it's often how are we accountable to the organisations and to the people who fund us. So for public donations, we're recognising it's people are making a choice to donate, and that reflects a confidence in the organisation that you're donating to. And we take this responsibility seriously, and our donor reporting, I guess, is only really one small part of the work that we do in the accountability space. And I think an equally important question is how are we accountable to the people we are supporting? So in the sector we call this beneficiary accountability. And I think this is an area of accountability that perhaps doesn't receive as much public scrutiny. So I want to provide some observations on both of these areas of accountability in the context of our current Syria appeal. So just to set the scene, 30 million people need humanitarian assistance to survive at the moment in the Syria crisis. 5 million of them are children. Each month, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent reaches 4.5 million people with some form of aid. And in 2015, the Red Cross Red Crescent movement provided 16 million people with safe drinking water, hygiene and household items to 1.6 million people, and food aid for 8.3 million people. So these numbers illustrate the magnitude of this situation. So many people are impacted and involved in this crisis. I don't think this is new news here. The Syrian Arab Red Crescent, the Jordanian Red Crescent, and the Lebanese Red Cross are the main national societies working with the people in the region. So they're when I spoke about having the three arms, it's the national societies. And they are being supported by the Federation and the ICRC. So in addition to that, the Red Cross Red Crescent's work is also supported by partners like Australian Red Cross and other national societies like the British Red Cross and the Swedish Red Cross. So this is a huge multi-million-dollar operation, and since 2012, Australian Red Cross has provided $4 million towards this work, and roughly half of that has been through public donations and half through the government. So just to clarify, Australian Red Cross is not implementing activities in Syria. We're supporting local staff and local volunteers who are working as part of their national societies. Because this is an advantage of working as a movement because we've combined resources and can support each other in areas of quality programming and accountability. So this is where I just want to provide some examples of ways, I guess, in which we focus on accountability. So first of all, we have our appeal intent. So when we're looking at our public appeal. So they exist for every appeal and define, usually quite broadly, how funds will be spent. And so internally within Australian Red Cross, we have a steering group that provides the oversight for this appeal, and it's where all decisions on the allocation of funding are documented and decided upon. So looking into this for the Syria appeal, just as sort of a way to try and answer some of the questions we were asked, around 96% of funds received for Syria have gone directly to the region. So most into what we call a mobilisation table, which is relief items like blankets, baby kits, food parcels and hygiene kits. And the remaining 4% has been on direct management costs. So some examples of that would be exchange rate fluctuations and monitoring visits from Melbourne, so that's where our headquarters is. So another example is that Australian Red Cross, we're a member of the Australian Council for International Development, so it's another acronym, it's ACFID, which is the peak body for development agencies. And we've signed up to the voluntary ACFID Code of Conduct. So the aim of this code is to increase stakeholder, and here I mean the public, trust by enhancing transparency and accountability of signatory organisations. So it sets out over 50 principles and 150 obligations, and they're linked to our shared values in 3 areas of accountability around program principles, public engagement and organisational. And then as an organisation, we have an annual self-assessment against this code. So again, as an example, something that we're trying to increase our focus on and our efforts on is beneficiary accountability. We're wanting to do more. So it's a 44-page document, and I'm not going to go into its detail, but it's on APFID website. So I encourage anyone interested in sector standards to have a look at it. So in addition to the APFID code, we've also received full accreditation from the Australian Government, which is a very involved process to check accountability of systems and processes, from ensuring we have program management guidelines to organisational policies around staffing to risk management and audit processes. And this is a requirement for our funding relationship with the government. So moving on from Australian Red Cross, there's some additional mechanisms within the broader Red Cross Red Crescent movement that I just wanted to mention. And again, they're just examples. There's a lot more, but I just wanted to mention some examples. So in relation to the Syria appeal, the Federation has an emergency appeal and emergency plan of action for Syria, and one for each of the neighbouring countries, Jordan and Lebanon. So the emergency plan of action for Syria outlines things such as how the movement partners are working together, who's supporting which activities, how much activities will cost, sharing priorities, and what are the gaps, and that sort of thing. Another global mechanism I guess I wanted to mention is the Red Cross Red Crescent Code of Conduct. And I'm mentioning this because I think it's really important in terms of individual responsibility. So it's for all staff and volunteers who work within the movement. And it guides how we apply the 7 fundamental principles, which are the ones that I mentioned at the beginning. And really, they are the core of what we do, being part of the Red Cross. So I know it sounds corny, but I think this is about workplace culture and values, and I think that is a really critical part of when we're thinking about accountability. So now I just wanted to touch a little bit on accountability to those who are receiving support. So the Red Cross Red Crescent believes that communication with beneficiaries is not a choice but a responsibility. Communities can be empowered by providing information to aid agencies, which in turn can be used to advocate and deliver solutions to genuine problems. The right information and advocacy at the right time and to the right people can bring about lasting impact and support effective and accountable aid delivery. An example from the Syria appeal is the cash transfer program that ARC has been funding and supporting, so not the whole, but supporting in Jordan. The program has actively encouraged feedback as a way to improve and better target support that the Jordanian Red Crescent is able to provide. So the program enables refugees to receive cash instead of goods. It stimulates the local market, but most importantly enables families themselves to make decisions about how best to meet their own needs. If a family needs medicine or shoes or bread, they can buy it and support local businesses in the process. There's nothing worse than driving past a refugee camp and seeing people selling blankets for $5 each in order to buy things they really need. So firstly, cash is central to being responsive to the needs of beneficiaries. Cash also needs some work to go into it. Most vulnerable refugees, such as people with disability, the elderly, female-headed households, are referred to the Red Cross by the UN Agency for Refugees. We meet with them, do home visits to check their conditions, educate them on how to use an ATM card. There are security controls. They use iris recognition software in the ATM machines to make sure nobody can falsify, defraud or steal benefits from the refugees. There is also a feedback hotline so that any complaints can be received, questions answered and follow-up provided. The Federation also conducts surveys of how the money is spent to better understand what the needs of the refugees are, how to make sure they're doing no harm and to keep the program on track. So these are just really a few examples of the mechanisms in place to ensure accountability and transparency in the context of what we're involved with through our appeal and through the Syria crisis. So I was thinking, what would my key messages be from this? And I've got two. Red Cross strives to be accountable to all, so people and organisations who fund humanitarian assistance, and to those who are receiving support. And for practitioners, for those working in this crisis-related situations, being accountable and transparent is at the core of the work that we do, because we want aid to have the best possible impact to support people to live.
Thank you so much, Emily. It was interesting ate up the power of imagery and how your desire was to show images tonight to get your message across. And of course, there are two reasons why images are so important in this area. Firstly, it shows people back home the need for help. And of course, it shows what organisations like the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement do. Of course, as you'd all be aware, very quickly after international crises, the cameras pack up and leave before the hard work is even starting, let alone coming to its conclusion. And in Syria, that's a striking example because the difficulties are so much greater. Not much independently verified information is getting out of Syria at all. So it was really reassuring, Emily, to hear you talk about how the efficacy of aid delivery is measured on the ground in a situation like Syria at that very specific ground level. Things like working out who is using, who is spending the money and things like that. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker will add